invited all former employees to come back. And I have a very funny story about the open house. My responsibility at the open house was to demonstrate a vendor. And Craig Broadbent and his wife and his wonderful, adorable 2 daughters came in. And so they all came over to this vendor, and Craig was explaining to them how a vendor worked. He said, so the part falls down, it gets checked, it gets moved over, it gets clamped. And all this kind of stuff happens, and the little girl's looking at it and says, Daddy, your job is boring. And we've been having monthly lunches at the shop for the employees with some prizes and excellent meals, and we have to thank Lydia for that. Just excellent food. So Lydia, if you ever are thinking of a career change, you can definitely open up catering. And I know I've said this before, but I've been at CMP for 22 years now, and I think we have the best team we've ever had. We get along well, we like each other for the most part. Right, Rob? Yep. Rob and I have been getting along kind of okay for a while. And, you know, we get the job done. We're getting the machines out the door, and so I think they're going well. I don't know if we're making any money. I hope so.
I hope so.
And so, you know, here's to another 25 years of CMP. I guess I could just mention, too, that for my part of the 25th celebration, I felt inspired to write a book about CMP, and I have it here. It's called One Shade of Gray. It's my memoir, being at CMP for 22 years. And I don't really want to talk about my book. I'm really proud of the book, but I don't really want to talk about it because last year, after my speech, some people came up to me and said, Phil, you went on way too long. It was a really boring speech. And so I don't want to get into my book. But maybe what I could do is just read a short review of the book. It's by a guy, I have it here, it's printed it, by a guy called Richard Snook from the New York Times. The book's been on the New York Times bestselling list for about 18 hours now. Anyway, I'm just going to read what he has to say. Phil Morgan's memoir, One Shade of Gray, draws the reader in very quickly as he chronicles stories of many events and changes that have shaped CMP in the last 25 years, pulling them all together to help the reader understand the modern identity of the world-class shop.
Yeah.
A 22-year veteran vendor builder, Morgan seems to recount with schoolboy-type glee the good old days, or bad old days, whichever way one wishes to look at it, when it was common practice to throw lit firecrackers into occupied washroom stalls, or place firecrackers in the bottom of the high-speed belt sander to be lit by the sparks from the hot steel when used by an unsuspecting co-worker. Dangerous stuff, to be sure, but it kept us on our toes. One day the shaft broke on the high-speed sander, resulting in the drive pulley spinning across the floor at 3,400 RPMs before hitting an object which deflected it up to the ceiling, where it rattled around the roof braces for about 10 seconds before coming crashing to the floor. There's also mention of a near-death experience where when Dan Weinhardt, the shop's owner, was working on a 600-volt electrical box that he didn't know was live. Upon inserting his screwdriver into the box, there was a huge electrical explosion. Miraculously, Mr. Weinhardt had squinted both eyes tightly just before the blast, in time to protect him from blindness. But when he opened his eyes, his face was completely black except for white around his eyes, leaving him look like a shocked raccoon. He really had to be there for that one. Earlier, the same said Mr. Weinhardt dropped a 24-foot-long piece of 4x4 structural steel on the top of his 1979 Volkswagen Rabbit, rendering it to the junkyard. It gave him an excuse to buy a new vehicle, though. Morgan also remembers fondly a time when it was commonplace for the wives of all the guys to phone their hard-working husbands at some point each day. He recalls how his heart would leap upon hearing Phil Morgan, line 1, over the shop PA, knowing that it was the wife of his youth, calling just to connect. He laments that this practice has long since been kiboshed by management. Music has always featured prominently in the atmosphere of the shop. A source of comfort and escape for some, a source of constant annoyance for others. Morgan falls into the second category. The musical genre of choice for the last few years has been a station which plays so-called contemporary alternative rock. Having grown up in what was undisputably the most creative and colorful era of popular music ever, the 60s and 70s, Morgan finds modern music uninspired at best, but more accurately, a mild form of psychological torture. After all, how could anybody ever compare Nickelback to the creative genius of the Beatles? Or why would anybody want to hear some guy repeating over and over in an angry voice, "I hate everything about you"? Yes, there is actually a song called that. Instead of the Beach Boys singing in beautiful harmony, "I'm picking up good vibrations." These type of questions perplex Morgan each and every day he comes into work. All in all, Morgan says today's music in the shop is just another gray brick in the wall. Morgan also takes it upon himself to share very openly what it was like to be officially diagnosed with GBD 2 years ago. GBD is a relatively recently acknowledged psychological disorder which stands for gray-based depression.
The shop is all gray.
1 in 4 people who work in gray shop environments. Symptoms of gray-based depression include difficulty getting out of bed in the morning on work days, extreme irritability, especially towards one's foreman, and a strong desire to leave work early, particularly on Friday afternoon. In advanced cases, it can lead to hallucinations while at work of catching salmon on a boat out on Lake Ontario on a bright summer afternoon. A counselor himself, Morgan, offers helpful advice to others who may be suffering from GBD, such as keeping a colorful calendar in one's work area, focusing on sporadic sources of color when walking around the shop, such as the yellow and red bins. He strongly encourages GBD sufferers to go outside and enjoy the color and beauty of God's creation at break or lunchtime as well, especially when the skies are not gray. CMP has certainly come a long way since its humble beginnings in a small shop down on Shade Street 25 years ago. Before we all had computers, the internet, smartphones, GPSs, and before ATS moved into its huge gray building on Royal Oak Road. It is a top-notch vendor and automated tool shop. Thanks to new policies, nowadays it is a much safer place to work as well, as you can see. And even though it is mostly one shade of gray on the inside, its future looks bright and diverse.